Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments on bicycle travel adventures. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/340, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 340th edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. On this edition, we are doing a kind of a fun episode about a maybe not so fun topic, and that is staying safe on your bicycle travel adventures. Look, we all know there's some inherent risk in bikepacking, bike touring, even bike commuting. You've got bad infrastructure, you've got inattentive drivers. Between all of those types of things, we assume some degree of risk every single time we're in the saddle. But as with anything that you do on a bike, there are things that we can do to make our bicycle adventure safer than by doing nothing at all. And on this episode, I'm going to give you some thoughts on all of the things that you can do to make your ride and your adventure that much safer. Just some things to think about. And let's start off at the basics of all of these things. It's important to take safety considerations into any ride that you do, but I think really in particular if you are doing any kind of bicycle travel. And that's because we are more exposed in our traveling than we are maybe in our commuting. First of all, we're exposed by time more. We're in the saddle longer. Also, it's not just the bicycling part of it. There's also the equipment that we are using that is separate and apart from the bicycle. There's also the fact that we're going to be traveling in different places that maybe we're not as familiar with, taking routes that we're not as familiar with that we're going to be maybe doing some camping, and there's some elements to that. There's the possibility of injury out there. There's animals. There's environmental factors. There's all sorts of different things. Personal safety. There's all sorts of things that we need to have in our mind as a part of any of our travels, so that we have at least some kind of a plan in the instance where we are encountering unsafe conditions in any of these places, and probably a few more than I'm not even thinking about right now. It's important to you, but it's also important to people that love you, your friends, your family. You know, they want to have that peace of mind that you are approaching this from a safe perspective. I know that's been the case for me, that, you know, especially when I was first getting into all of this, there are concerns, you know, a lot of folks that just don't understand that bicycle travel is a thing, and that touring and bike packing, that you can do it in a safe way. A lot of folks look at it as an aggressively unsafe type of situation. In fact, there are some insurance companies that consider this to be an extreme sport, which is hysterical to me. But it is true that there's a higher exposure of risk, and therefore they need you to do this in a safe way as well. So addressing your safety concerns is a really crucial thing, not only for you, but for other people around you in order to have an enjoyable and safe journey. So let's talk a little bit about some of those types of things. I think that the first foundational thing that you need to be thinking about is to think about safety before you get rolling. Before you embark on your bikepacking or bicycle touring adventure, it's really important that you put some thought into this. There are lots of folks that love to go from couch to bike and then they just roll. I would encourage you to think about safety as a foundational piece of your journey. If you don't, then you run the risk of being unprepared if you come face to face with a safety situation of some of the things that we're talking about. So being prepared is not just for Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and other scouts. It's for you too. Being prepared for the types of situations you may be encountering, really important. Having situational awareness is really, really important. For those of us who live in cities, this is sort of pounded into us quite a bit. You know your surroundings, know who's around you, know what's going on, be aware of what's going around you. I think that's incredibly important for folks in the bicycle travel context as well. And also be aware of what responsible behavior is on the road, because in many instances, we encounter situations from a safety perspective effective because we are acting outside of norms, and that ends up creating conflict. And so what we want to do is we want to try to avoid any and all conflict and make sure that we are being that good ambassador that I always talk about for us as bicycle tourists, backpackers, bicycle travelers out there. There's a part of me that feels like that I have not done a good service in this area. I often, in my prep episodes, the episodes that describe what's going to be happening in a future tour, I very rarely talk about safety in and of itself. There are a whole bunch of things that I do that are all part of safety, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here. I think in some ways, I've always had this be a bit of an unspoken thing in terms of bicycle travel, and I think at this point, I want to make this a little bit more overt, a little bit more stated in future prep episodes, because I do think it's important that you consider it as part of the beginning of any tour that you're on. But also, some of the things that you may have in your head for safety may not include a whole bunch of things that I do. And maybe when we meet in the middle here, you'll understand what I'm talking about a little bit more here. So let's start off about the first category, and that is route and destination safety. The idea here is that the route that you choose, you really want to make sure that it is a safe one. I am very, very open about how I will plan my routes out, often using Google Street Maps, especially in environments where it looks like there could be a lot of car conflict, or where I'm not sure what the infrastructure looks like for cycling in certain areas. This has been really true on some of the routes in Florida that I've done, and in other places where it's not on, say, a state bike route or an Adventure Cycling Association bike route. Even those sometimes go through some dodgy areas as well in terms of infrastructure. So you want to make sure that you're looking at every possible avenue for deciding whether or not an area that you're looking at cycling through is indeed safe for you to be cycling. And I'm not talking about this like, oh, this is a bad neighborhood. It's more, is there space for you to occupy as a cyclist? Are you going to be on a separated piece of infrastructure, a path, a separated bike lane, things like that? Those are your ideal setups. But you may find yourself having to go through a certain part of, say, a city or the edge of a city or something like that, where bike infrastructure is really good in the city, but as you start to exit it, it actually starts to go down. I have found that sometimes suburbs are some of the worst places to go because they are so car-centric that as I'm rolling through it on any kind of a bit of a bicycle tour, bicycle traveling, commuting, whatever, that the infrastructure disappears, and I need to make sure that I've got an opportunity to ride safely. And as I've shared with you on many occasions, I will hop on a sidewalk, no problem. In fact, a lot of times sidewalks in these suburban areas are actually considered part of bike infrastructure. Is it very good bike infrastructure? Absolutely not, but it is better than being on a shoulderless strode, for instance. So making sure that you are aware of your route. I think one of the greatest tools that are out there, of course, is Google Street View. I've talked about that a lot. But looking at the heat maps on Strava, looking at the types of community-derived maps on an app like Ride with GPS, all super, super helpful. Also, don't forget about local advice. I've seen a lot of folks who will ask on bicycling forums about routes in and around a city and asking for local advice by local cycling organizations. Going to those websites. Maybe they've got a Discord or a subreddit someplace. Those are wonderful resources for you when you're looking in places that you're not familiar with. When it comes to your destination, that's when we start thinking more about what is this destination? Are you camping in a really rural area where it's very unlikely anyone's going to be around? Well, that's probably going to be on the safer side of things. I know a lot of people see a lot of horror movies and things like that and think maybe that's a little bit less than safe, but those are movies. This is real life. I think that the types of campgrounds that a lot of us end up in, those tend to be very safe. They're established. Sometimes they even have security, things like that. When you are going to a hotel, many hotels, although not all of them, will allow you to bring your bike in so you don't worry about theft or anything along those lines. Knowing what your accommodations are and what it is in a surrounding area, all really important. I recently just finished a tour in San Francisco, and it's a great city, but as we all know, there's a ton of bicycle theft there. In 1,000 years, I would never leave my bicycle locked up overnight within San Francisco. It's just a bad idea, especially for a unique unique bike, a bike that might draw some attention like my touring bike. So it went inside with me, and thankfully that was available to me. Making sure that you've got those kinds of elements around safety, and there's personal safety, and then there's your personal belongings safety that we're talking about here too. All of that is really important, and think about that in advance as much as you can. Many of you will be doing tours where you're not sure where you're going to end up staying. That goes back to situational awareness, right? So when you're getting to a place where you are going to be finishing your day, maybe it's a hotel, maybe it's easy like that. You can bring everything in with you, but maybe it's in an unfamiliar place where you're camping. Are you stealth camping? Then we got to look at all of the different stealth camping rules that we've talked about before, and making sure that you're really well hidden. You have no trace, no impact, things like that. That's all part of this route and destination safety category that I'm talking about here. Next category, traffic and road safety. This really probably should be the first category, let's be perfectly honest, because when you're out riding, you've got to make sure that you are doing it in a safe way. That can be your choice of route, like we talked about before, but also it's going to be what kind of equipment do you have on there. Staying visible is a really important thing. We've got a lot of side conversations here about what is the obligation of a cyclist to act and what are the obligations of folks who are operating motor vehicles to act. And I think that there's been too much placed on make sure you wear your helmet and make sure you're wearing neon yellow. I do think that there's been a shift of responsibility away from some of those motor vehicle operators. However, they're in big, heavy metal boxes and you are not. And it's really important that we take an outsized role in our safety when it comes to being on the road. So that means, wearing the reflective gear where it's appropriate. My rain jacket has tons of reflective stuff on it. The Showers Pass, for those of you who are familiar with it. My bike lights, I make sure those are charged up and they're operating when I'm in conditions where it makes sense to have those going on. But also how you ride is really important when you're out on roads. Be predictable. Use those hand signals. Be aware of the traffic that's around you. Know that it's very easy for a driver to lose attention for a moment, and they can travel hundreds of feet while they're maybe fiddling with their radio or with their CarPlay device or something like that. And that could include a space that you are occupying. So making sure that you are as aware of your surroundings as possible to avoid that type of collision, for lack of a better way of putting it. I think that the most challenging types of roads to be on are the ones that have the least amount of infrastructure. Sometimes, though, it's when there's that little bit of infrastructure, it's the worst when it's being used in a way that it wasn't designed for. And I'm looking at sidewalks. I've already mentioned that sidewalks are sometimes your best bet, but you also have to understand the limitations with them. When you're riding a bicycle on a sidewalk, drivers especially are not looking at a sidewalk as a bicycle pathway. They're used to people moving at the speed of walking, not necessarily going 8-10 miles per hour or however fast you're going on a sidewalk. So folks, you've got to make sure that you're aware of all of that. Anytime I'm coming in a place where my mode of travel on the bicycle is coming in some kind of conflict with motorized vehicles, and that is a lot when you're on a sidewalk, more than just intersections, all of the pull-ins and pull-outs for all of those various grocery stores and big box stores that you're going through. You've got to be very careful about all of that. I have been hit as a pedestrian on a sidewalk going through one of those areas. Not very hard, but it was like just sort of like, come on, man. So you really do want to make sure that you're very aware of those types of things and make sure that you are navigating all of those different areas on the road and on sidewalks and on bike lanes with head on a swivel as necessary. The more vehicles around you, I think the more defensive that you want to be in those types of things. Some of you, this is not negotiable. You're just not going to do it. And frankly, I don't blame you at all. For those of you who do more bikepacking types of things, you're sort of here talking about traffic and road safety going, why? Why am I listening to this? But some of you may end up doing a little bit of road work to get to your single track and some of the other places that you're going to. So you got to be mindful of the road stuff as well. Next category is all about your gear and your equipment safety. We've been talking a lot about other people operating motor vehicles, and maybe to a certain limited extent, our gear, our bicycles themselves. Obviously, you want your bicycle to be in tip-top shape, or at least in as good shape as it can possibly be before you're going on a real extended kind of a ride. Making sure those brakes are in good shape, making sure that your bike is shifting appropriately, making sure that everything that's going to give you the most wide method of controlling your bicycle is all working perfectly good. That doesn't mean that these things won't fail potentially while on rides. Hello, this has happened to me on several occasions. But I think that the most important ones are things like brakes and steering tubes and all of those other things, making sure that all of that is good. Those racks, you want to make sure that those are as secure as possible. I've ridden before where a rear rack has literally come detached and fallen backwards into my tire, and that is super freaking dangerous. So make sure you do really good once-overs on all of your gear, but also the things that are strapped onto your bike, those panniers, those bike packing bags. All of that needs to be extra secure. Give it a good tug. Make sure it's there. One of the crazier things that I've had happen, it happens when either a pair of headphones or, for lack of a better word, a rope or clothing falls down and gets wrapped up inside of a rotating wheel. That can really throw you over your handlebars in a hurry. So you got to be very, 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 very mindful of all of that. We talked about protective equipment like lights before and reflectivity. Obviously, you want all of that. We talked more about that in a prior category. But what about some of your safety gear? Do you wear a helmet? Is a helmet a part of what you want to have on while you're riding? I tend not to wear helmets in some circumstances, but I will say, especially when I'm doing any degree of road riding on tour, I do wear a helmet all the time. I will leave that up to you. I do think that there are some circumstances over others where wearing a helmet is more important than others. Some people will never get on their bike without a helmet, just like they don't operate a motor vehicle without clicking in their seatbelt. All of these things are things that are part of your personal attention to gear and equipment safety. And one last thing before I get into this, I sort of alluded to this already. Make sure that you're maintaining your bicycle and all of the gear around it as necessary on the bike. I am not great about doing good with my chain, for instance. That's a safety issue, and that's something that I should be better about. I see lots of people who are absolutely religious about cleaning and lubricating their chains every night. Be more like them, be less like me. That's all I have to say. Check those brakes. Check how the steering is going. Check everything. Check your tires. I've had issues with tires before, and losing a tire or having a worn tire that blows out on you can be very dangerous if you're in the wrong circumstance. If you are bombing down a hill and all of a sudden you have a blowout, that is a very serious problem. So make sure you're on top of all of those things. Your bicycle is really, really, think about this. You're essentially traveling on an inch or 2 or 3, depending on the width of your tires, of rubber. And that narrow thing is contacting road or dirt or asphalt or gravel or whatever. And that is a difference between you moving at a decent speed and then or falling off of your bike at a pretty decent speed. So make sure that gear is in really tip-top shape and check it frequently. Daily is ideal. At the end of the day, at the beginning of a day, whatever, that is a really big safety issue. And I would encourage you to do that. Next category is health and first aid when you're on the road. This doesn't come up a ton for me. I have not injured myself more than a handful of times. I've never fallen off of my bike where I've cut myself or anything like that. Despite that, I carry a variety of different things in a first aid kit in case I ever did get a little road rash or something like that. I've been very fortunate. But I think part of the reason why I've been fortunate is because I do some of those other things that we talked about, making sure that the bike's in good shape, making sure that I'm riding in a reasonable way. But, making sure that you've got a good first aid kit, I think is a really important thing should something go wrong. And you don't have to carry a lot. You don't have to carry a full medical kit for all sorts sorts of different situations. I've seen some really crazy first aid kits for people who are on tour that include stuff that I'm like, wait, is that for if you get shot? Like there's some really crazy gauze packages and stuff that I've seen. But hey, if that's what you feel comfortable with, do it. But you don't necessarily need a full kit to be practicing good safety while on the road. You also want to make sure that you're treating yourself really well. I think that there's often a lot of talk about food and hydration and stuff like that on this podcast and other places. That's a safety issue too. Making sure you don't bunk in the middle of nowhere is a safety issue. Making sure that you are hydrated is a safety issue, because that can really create problems for you if you're in a really hot climate, or a desert climate or whatnot. Believe it or not, hygiene can be a really important thing. If you're making sure, I don't really talk too much about down there, but down there is a really important area. It's the contact point with your bike. Regardless of what you have, what parts you have down there, they are going to be in contact with that saddle. And we need to make sure that that is kept in a good, clean place, because that prevents things like saddle sores and other chafing and things like that I typically don't talk about on this show because it makes me rather uncomfortable. I don't know why. I talk about all sorts of things, but not that. But make sure that you're staying clean and dry down there, however it makes the most sense. I have talked a little bit about it on one particular episode about merino wool, the question about whether or not you want to put lubricating substances and stuff like that. Different people, different body parts, different needs. Go check out that past podcast episode for more information on that. But I will say that when it comes to this type of stuff, make sure you've got good food, you've got good water, and you've got some amount of first aid capabilities on you, because you may find yourself getting injured in a place where there's no one else to help you whatsoever. And you've got to give yourself at least first aid, if not more advanced aid, depending on where you're at. You bike packers, you could be in the middle of nowhere. So you in particular, even though you're carrying teeny tiny little amounts of stuff, make sure you've got the capabilities to give yourself some real first aid should you take a tumble off of the bike and find yourself in some trouble. Next category, wildlife and environmental safety. I've talked about this in the context of loose dogs on tour before, but you do want to be careful about wildlife encounters generally. For bike packers, this includes making sure you're practicing good food safety out in the bush. If you are going to need to do a bear bag, make sure you've got the ability to do that. Make sure you know how to do that. It's really, really important. For those of you who are doing more like traditional road cycling, you're not really going to be dealing with that kind of stuff so much unless you're camping in places where there's bear activity. Make sure you know it if you're going there. Check in where the information board is. They'll tell you. Sometimes there's wildcats or things like that that you need to be mindful of. Sometimes it's more mundane. It's raccoons and other things like that. Not so much a safety issue, but certainly a comfort issue. You got to make sure you keep your food separate from wildlife, because that will create problems for you. Wildfire smoke. That is something that we want to be careful of from an environmental safety perspective. Yeah, we all have masks now, or at least we have some that are useful in this context. Inhaling wildfire smoke is bad. It hurts. It's no good. Trust me, I've done it. I have no problem masking up during all of that, and I think you should too, or at least you should consider it. It's better for you, and it's something that you should be mindful of. But also be mindful of more traditional kinds of environmental challenges: extreme heat, extreme cold, rain, snow, ice. Know your limits in all of these things. It's important to know when it's okay to take a 0 day. I've talked about 0 days before on the show in a variety of different contexts. The one that I'm thinking of right now is taking the extra day in Big Sur with James way back in the day, because it was going to be really nasty and really cold and wet and windy. And we had the greatest day ever. Taking that 0 day was the best choice ever. Knowing that sometimes Type 2 fun is not just a Type 2 fun kind of a thing, but it's a safety concern. Be realistic about your limits. Understand that sometimes it's just not worth going through the bad weather just to make time or to get forward another day. Live to cycle another day. That's what I would say when it comes to all of that. When I first started thinking about doing a safety episode, I was thinking that a lot of you might be thinking about this and only this category, and that is personal security and theft prevention. I've already talked about it a little bit in the context of bicycle theft. In San Francisco, I talked about in that specifically, but I know for many of you, personal safety is a concern. Some of you, it's less of a concern. Some of you, it's more of a concern. I have read on a variety of different subreddits and forums, it feels like this one comes up a lot. Should I carry a firearm? This is very US centric, obviously. For those of you in other countries, you may be like, carry a what now? That is something that I don't personally feel necessary. I suppose that some of you might. I think that's a pretty not extreme, but it's certainly a choice. I don't think it would be necessary in the vast majority of circumstances. But I know if I was talking to an Alaskan and you're going through bear country or something like that, they wouldn't dream of going someplace without some kind of a firearm on them. Okay, that might be a reasonable choice right there. I think for most people, a firearm's probably not necessary. If you're going through places that make you feel that uncomfortable for your personal safety, I'd go back to one of my earlier categories and have you maybe rethink the routing, perhaps. If you're going through a locality that makes you feel unsafe, then reconsider going through there, period. That's what I would say. When it comes to theft, that's also another big topic. And I've done a whole bunch of different episodes on this show about locking up your bike and securing your belongings and things along those lines. I have found in most, actually, I shouldn't say most, the vast majority of my circumstances, even going through cities of note, I don't tend to find theft to be too much of an issue, with the obvious exceptions. San Francisco is a great example. I would say DC even. While I have locked up my bike for a short period of time with just panniers and stuff like that, I think that's all going to be very dependent on the nature of the stop, where it is, what's going on around me, the time of day. Situational awareness, again, is really, really important. If you're going to be someplace where you're worried about your bike, bring a good bike lock. That's really, really an important type of thing. I'm here to tell you that it's unlikely that someone's going to go through your panniers or your bike bags. Is it possible, depending on the circumstances? Sure. But again, reconsider where you're stopping if that's a real thing. I mean, preventing the access in the first place is probably your best bet in terms of being worried about theft and things like that. I think ultimately it goes back to the earlier global concept of situational awareness and being vigilant about what's going on around you anytime you're someplace where you're concerned about that personal security or theft going on. If your spidey sense is going off, listen to it. You don't have to always stop in places where you think you have to stop. There are generally going to be other options available for you. If you find yourself in a place where it is literally the only opportunity, well, try to make some choices about where you put the bike, how long you go into wherever you're going in. Make choices to improve the security of your stuff and go with it that way. Hopefully you're not in that kind of a scenario where you feel somewhat forced to insert yourself into a situation that feels unsafe from a personal safety or a theft perspective, but do what you can to avoid all of that in the first place. And last category that I want to talk about here is having plans, emergency preparedness. I think it's really important to have some kind of a sense. Think about what you would do in any of these types of scenarios that I've already talked about. What would happen if you fell off your bike and there was no one there? What would be the first thing you would do? What would you want to have in that scenario? Would all you want is a cell phone to call 911? Okay, well, that's certainly a piece of it. But some of us, me included, I want to make sure that I would be able to administer my own first aid as much as possible. So I've got a limited first aid kit that comes with me in addition to my cell phone. Okay, so there you go. That's enough emergency preparedness right there. Just even coming up with the first few things that you would do when confronted with something like that. Do you have a plan if you're cycling through, say, Kentucky? Kentucky gets thrown under the bus so much on this podcast. I've never been there cycling, but I hear some terrible things about loose dogs. What is your plan if you end up getting chased by a dog? Are you going to bring an extra water bottle to squirt at them? Are you going to bring an air horn? Are you just going to bike really, really fast? Those are the types of things that you want to think about. Have a plan when you have all of these things confronting you. There are going to be times when you get unexpected emergencies, things that you are not planning for. I think in that instance, we go back to the basics again. Situational awareness. Do you have stuff on you in case things go sideways? Extra clothes if you get hit by a sudden storm. The first aid kit if you do end up having an injury. An extra battery. An emergency meal. All of these are all safety concerns. I brought these things up a million times in the show, but never used the word, I think, safety as a part of it. All of those are safety items, and they are all part of emergency preparedness and making sure that you've got contingencies in case something goes sideways that you weren't planning for, or maybe you thought about and this was part of what your pre-planning process was. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things around safety. We've talked about route and destination safety, traffic and road safety, gear and equipment, health and first aid. We've talked about wildlife and environmental conditions, personal security and theft prevention, and then finally, emergency preparedness. This is not, I think, a comprehensive list of things. Many of you have probably thought about some other things as well. I would love to hear from you if there are things that you think about in terms of bicycle travel, whether it's bikepacking or bicycle touring or anything like that. What do you do in terms of safety considerations? Or do you think I'm overthinking it? Everyone's got a sense for their own risk tolerance and what they want to do to feel safe in the context of bicycle travel. So do what makes you feel good and make sure that you do everything that you need to do to have that peace of mind before you go on your bicycle adventures, because we all run into situations. And my number one goal is to make sure that all of you feel as safe as possible, and in fact are as safe as possible when you're out there riding your ride.
And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Hankel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zaranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Lazuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponsella, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Sarus Faravar, John Gardner, Sam Scruggs, Dwight Pintinger, Connie Bowder, Rob Merrifield, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.